Okay, can you hear me? Good. Welcome to the next event of the Hellenic-American Cultural Foundation. My name is Nicholas Karides, and I'm chairman of the foundation, and Robert Shore, who is the vice chairman of the foundation. Tonight begins our 14th year of presenting sessions on culture and the arts. The foundation's goal is to engage the community to explore and rediscover the importance of Greek contributions to and add to the development of the appreciation and extraordinary legacy of Greek culture. Tonight is no exception and is consistent with this goal. The foundation has held more than 40 events during the last 14 years and strives to find topics of interest and relevance for the general public. We are honored tonight to have with us Professor Emeritus Tony Molho, who will discuss his moving and important book, Courage and Compassion, A Jewish Boyhood in German-Occupied Greece. He will discuss this book in conversation with Professor Mark Mazower, a member of our advisory council. Let me now turn over the introductions to our vice chairman and board member, Robert Shaw, who put together this event, as well as, I may say, many other events. And he will introduce Professor Molho and Professor Mazower. Before doing that, I would like to thank member of the board, Marilena Christodoulou, for arranging to have this lovely space available for us. Also, I want to recognize in particular the Greek Consul General in New York, Iphigenie Kanara, who is here with us tonight. She has been very actively engaged with the foundation and has attended some of our previous events. She is extremely thoughtful and helpful and has been an invaluable source for the New York community. And now let me turn it over to Robert.
Thank you, Nick. You've all got programs, and they give you short biographical summaries of our two guests tonight, Professor Molho and Professor Mazower. I will go directly to the theme rather than reading out what's already in the program about them. When our friend Fotis Kalambiakos recommended inviting Professor Molho, he referenced his book, which I then bought and read, and I found it to be an unusually poignant but also objective book. What's extraordinary is he writes about matters that are of such intense personal nature, and yet at the same time, his background as a professional historian is apparent. He talks about these incredibly poignant events, but yet doesn't lose the objectivity of the professional academic historian. And this is an extraordinary achievement, I think. And I think you will find this talk tonight not only moving on the personal level, but, as I say, an extraordinary achievement because of this ability to be dispassionate. He talks about courage and compassion, but he also talks about some of the darker sides of human nature that were apparent in those times, but never in an impassioned, at least in an unobjective way. Mark is a very good friend of ours. As Nick has already said, Mark has been instrumental in participating in two of our events. One, a film that he collaborated on concerning migration, and it was at the time of the very big migration into many of the Aegean islands in the last decade. And he also came and spoke to us about his book that was published in 2021 on the Greek Revolution and its significance for modern Europe. So we're very privileged to have both of them here and very much look forward to their discussion. Tony will begin with a few introductory remarks, and then Mark and Tony will have their discussion, and then at the end we will open it up for a short period for questions.
this very interesting and active and useful committee for having invited me to talk to you about my book. Their hospitality is exemplary, and not only in the usual sort of ways, but also in arranging for this beautiful weather in New York. So I'm very grateful to them. We agreed with Mark that I would start a little bit with a few comments. I tend to talk too much, so I told Mark if I overstep the limits, he should stop me.
And I refused.
Now then, there are a number of people who have asked me about this book. It deals with my childhood, from the time I was 4 years old to the time I was 6, with some afterthoughts of what happened thereafter. And now I am 86, and some people have asked me, what took you so long? Why did it take you so long to write this book? The flippant answer is that I write slowly. But that's not only flippant. If I had the time necessary, which at my age I don't, to sit down for many sessions with a psychiatrist, he or she might be able to tease out the reasons for this great delay. The fact of the matter is that for years, for decades, I sort of puzzled over the challenge of writing a book like this. Not only did I puzzle over it, but my mother, who was a very strong presence in my life, kept insisting that I write something about that experience. And in a new postface to the book that has not yet been published, I talk about a very strong and emotional conversation that she and I had near my home in Florence in 1984 or 85. I tried very hard to remember if it's 84 or 85. I can't quite pin it down, but that's not very important. In which she sort of pinned me intellectually, by saying, okay, you've written about the Renaissance, you've written about commerce, you've written about states. Why don't you write something about our own experience? What is it that's holding you back? To make a long story short, in 2022, I had COVID, and I was isolated in a hospital room in Athens for 11 days. And after it was clear, to me at least, if not all the members of my family, that I was going to make it, I started thinking about what I was going to do with all this free time I had in my hand. And I decided, this is it. Either you do it now, or you get it out of your system, you get it out of your mind. And I decided to sit down and try at least to see what sort of book I could write. When I started thinking about it, there's one question that was ever present in my mind. It was the key question. And the question is this. In Salonika, in March of 1943, there are about 50 to 55,000 Jews. The numbers are disputed. It's not necessary to pin the numbers down. In the spring of 1945, 2 years later, anywhere between 90 and 95% of that Jewish population of Salonika had been exterminated in Auschwitz. And the question in my mind was, how is it possible when in this immense catastrophe, my father, my mother and I were able to survive? Why were we an exception to the rule? And this is the question that I puzzled over again and again and again as I was trying to write this book. The answer, very synoptically, is this, in my mind at least. There are three considerations that I think help to explain our luck, if you will. The first was good luck. If we didn't have good luck, nothing else would have mattered. This answer, part of the answer in my mind, sort of overlaps with an experience that I had when I was a young doctoral student in Florence back in 1962. I remember very well the sort of frisson of excitement that I felt when I was reading the works of a Florentine historian of the early 16th century, Francesco Guicciardini, who came back time and again to the question of the importance of luck, fortuna, in the affairs of humankind. He says at a certain point, and this thought came back to my mind as I was writing, he says, when I see an old man, I have to wonder, how is it possible that from a small baby, that so many things could have gone wrong, that old man was able to grow and become an old man? Luck. And I think that this was very much the case with my family. Good luck. The second partial answer to my initial question was courage. My parents' decision in March of 1943 to leave behind everything, which was not an easy thing to do at all. To leave for my mother, to leave her parents, her brother and her sister, who in the end all perished in Auschwitz. For my father to leave his mother, who miraculously survived. To leave me, to entrust me to the care of a Christian family, which assumed the responsibility and the risk of hiding a small Jewish boy, and to try to make it on foot from Salonika to Athens. I describe their adventures as they were told to me after the war in one of the chapters of this book. The Great Escape, I call this chapter, in which they met an infinity of challenges and dangers, and thanks to their ingenuity, to their courage, and to their conviction that they had to survive, above all for one reason, because they had left me in the care of unknown people, and they wanted me to have his parents, my parents, after the war. Of course, they didn't know there was going to be an after the war. They were hoping to survive. So courage and the almost unimaginable decision to abandon everything and to leave their home is part of the answer. And the third part of this triptych of answers has to do with the courage and conviction of a small number of people, not infinitesimally small, but not very large either, who encountered my parents in the course of the war, and assuming the risk that any decent person would want to assume, decided to try to help. There is a a confrontation between my mother and a railroad engineer somewhere near Lamia in central Greece after my mother was arrested by the police. And the train engineer's decision and fright at the curse that my mother promised on his children's fate if she were to be turned over to the German police that was waiting a few kilometers down the road. And the engineer rose to the occasion, took the risk, and did what I describe in the book he had to do to save my mother. There are any number of people, some of them well-placed in Greek society, such as the Mother Superior of a Catholic monastery at Patisia, Pamakaristos, who took the responsibility to save all three members of my family by keeping me in the convent, by arranging through her own contacts that my father joined the underground, and he did, where he was in the mountain for about 15, 16 months, having disappeared entirely from my mother's life. And then my mother, by helping her to become the second cook in a very prominent and affluent Greek family, the Fix, the producers of beer, who in plain knowledge, but without acknowledging it explicitly, took the risk of keeping my mother in their house. There are any number of such incidents that I try to describe, trying to emphasize in this book, and I'll close with this thought, trying to emphasize not simply the dark side of what happened during the war. That is well known. And the weight of that dark side has been with me, and certainly with my parents after the war, for the rest of their lives. But I wanted to tease out of that complex situation, that complex story, elements of goodness, of hope, of optimism that might cast a little bit of light on our own rather dark times today and our collective unwillingness to do for others what some people in wartime Greece did for my father, my mother, and for me. I stop now and I turn it over to Mark.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to continue on that theme that you've ended with, because there was one story that you tell that's haunted me, and it's quite unlike any other anecdote that I've come across from those years anywhere. And since I have you as a captive here, I'd like to hear a little more about it. It's the moment where, in the summer of 1944, both you and your mother are in Athens. She's getting a little more confident. The end of the German occupation is in sight. And the two of you board the tram one day to go to her work. And then suddenly plainclothes policemen get on at either end of the tram, and they're looking and checking people's papers, and she panics. And there's a fracas, and at a certain moment the tram driver opens the central doors, and in a flash your mother puts your hand in the hand of the man standing next to you, jumps off the tram, disappears. The doors close, the tram goes on. And you don't say anything, and the man doesn't say anything. And in the next station stop, he moves towards the exit, and you follow him. You get down. He walks back the way the tram had come. There's your mother running up, and they exchange a few words and he disappears. And so that little episode seems to speak to many of the things that you've just talked about. The chance of who happened to be standing next to you. Your mother's quite extraordinary courage or decisiveness, I'm not quite sure what to call it.
Or craziness.
Craziness. I mean, she was a very formidable person, evidently. And this extraordinary reaction of the man. And I would love to hear a little more about your thoughts about that, because it seemed to me a whole world of social assumptions and social values is in a way implicit in that little episode. Assumptions that your mother was making, assumptions that the man was making. Actually, you too, who didn't protest. Can you say a little more about that?
Well, I can try. This is an incident that has puzzled me. I can say without any exaggeration, it has puzzled me all my life. I've thought about it time and time again. Why is it that my mother, mind you, this episode, as I describe it, I do so through the filter, not of my own memories, but of the descriptions of my mother's. But of course, these descriptions, right after the war, and their repetition several times, have slowly become part of my memories, even though they're not my direct memories. I have internalized them. Why all this? The short answer is, I don't know. But I can speculate, as I have done a little bit in the book. Why would an unknown person, in the midst of the fracas in the tram, as police are trying to arrest somebody, people are shouting and so on, why would my mother take my hand and put it in the hand of this unknown man? Nothing, as far as I can tell, was said by either of them. What is it that inspired this unknown person to sort of hold my hand and not say a word? It would have been very easy for somebody else to call the police. They were right there, and say, here's a kid who's alone. Nobody's taking care of him. Take him. He didn't. I speculate that for all the talk of collaboration with the German occupying authorities in Greece, and there's been a lot of talk about that by distinguished historians, I speculate that there was also, how shall I say, a residue of resistance, of discomfort that seeped down to all levels of Greek society. And I refer in the book to the funeral of Kostis Palamas a few months before, when a huge crowd, amounting to, it is said, to more than 100,000 people in full German occupation, gathered to follow the funeral procession and listen to another distinguished poet, Angelos Sikelianos, deliver the funeral oration, that this was an act of resistance, which bespoke all levels of behavior in Greek society. I imagine, without having any clear evidence of that, that this was the reason this man decided to take my hand and keep me. He realized that my mother, by her action, by her behavior, was a suspect of the authorities. And being a suspected person, he, this unknown man, chose to offer his solidarity towards a person who is in danger at the moment. If I may, I would like to spin this out a bit. The reason I speculate that is that right after the war, I witnessed myself a couple of incidents that are perhaps comparable in their dynamic to the incident in the tram. My father, as I said, was a member of the resistance of Hellas during the war. And he felt, for the rest of his life, a deep sense of gratitude towards the resistance for having taken him in, for having incorporated him in the group, for having helped to save him. So after the war, when he opened his store in Thessaloniki on Kapodistriou Street number 2, I witnessed twice the same incident that I'm about to describe. Towards dusk, the end of the day, there's a man, not always the same man, who would show up around the corner. When my father would see him, he would send the clerks to their homes. He would invite this man into the store. He would draw the blinds down. He would move a table out of the way and open the entrance to a basement in the store. He would ask this man to go down, close the entrance, put the table over the entrance, it would not be visible, and leave the store. These people were members of the left who at the time, right after the war, were being hunted down by the security police. Now, why do I compare these two incidents, which are really quite different one from the other? Because there's an issue of motivation. What is it that drove my father to take a risk? This was a real risk in Greece, 1946-47, before the end of the Civil War, but even after. These incidents took place before the end of the Civil War. Why did he do it? Because he felt that he had a moral obligation to help somebody who was in danger. There was, as I speculate in the book, working in him what is expressed in an untranslatable Greek word, untranslatable in English, philotimo, the friendship of one's own honor, the need to defend one's honor, to be a decent person. That, I think, is what explains my father's behavior. And in the end, for lack of any additional evidence, this is, I think, what might explain the behavior of this unknown man on the tram.
So, I mean, what you've just done is what you do time and again in the book, and it's one of the things that makes it very special, which is you have a very strange kind of archive to work off in this book. You're a historian, so you're used to working in archives, but this is a very unusual kind of archive that's made up of memories, sometimes not your own, sometimes impossible to tell anymore whether they're your own or composites, or wartime photographs that were somehow miraculously saved in a box that were thrown out into the street, or odd memories, or even pieces of evidence such as your own name. You've assembled this very distinctive archive, which is in a way the only kind of archive from which you can write a book like this. But then what you do is it's a sort of semiotic approach. You're reading them as a historian. One is in this double world of the little boy, but also the world of the historian at the same time. Could you tell us a little bit about that procedure, which strikes me as must have been something you were working out for yourself as you were writing it?
Yes, I was. This is not a social scientific book. There are some people who have not exactly challenged me, but they wanted to know more about my method. And the only thing I could say about my method is that every time I thought I was encountering a complicated methodological issue, I tried to get around it. I didn't want to confront it. This was not the right occasion. But the issue, and this is something that I think about very often. Here I am, 86 years old. And there I was, 4 or 5 years old. Am I the same person? I don't know. Time plays its own tricks. And time, the little boy that I tried to imagine myself being as I was writing this book did not know the outcome of this story. When I was at the convent, and then I went because the nuns had heard that I had been betrayed and the police were going to raid the convent one night. I was carried to the house of a poor widow who had 5 children and willingly took me on as another mouth to feed. I didn't know that this was an unusual. I thought, this is what I go through. I didn't think about it, of course, as the common experience of children. Somebody in a review in an Athens newspaper wrote, so Tony Molho lost his childhood years. Well, I'm not sure I lost anything. I mean, that was the experience I had. So on the one hand, there's the little boy, a previous version of myself, if you will, who stumbles through life, unawares of what the odds are and what the stakes are. And on the other hand, there's the old man sitting comfortably in his study and trying to sort all this out. But he knows what the outcome was. And so these two worlds of a boy who's stumbling through life and an old man who's wondering, what did the young boy think about all this? How did he react? Why was it? I mean, one of the I think it's interesting for my own education and development, the fact that during those 2 years, I had an experience of living with Christian families. And I attended church. And I served as altar boy. And how is it that on Easter Sunday of 1944, my mother showed up at the proavlio of the church, and I did not recognize her, or at least I pretended not to recognize her. I don't know which of the two is true. And when my mother asked the priest next to whom I was standing after Mass, "Is this a good boy?" And the priest said, "Yeah, he's a very good boy." And then he turned to me and said, "Tell this nice lady what you want to be when you grow up? And the answer, my answer, automatically, he says, I want to be the Archbishop of Athens. How does one interpret that? So it is those two levels. Time, trying to project into the future, stumbling along, and time cast from the present to the past, and trying to make sense of all these events. One more thing, if I may say so. One of the challenges I had as I began to write this book was how we're going to organize it. There are some people, especially one of my daughters, who said, write a story of your family so that we know what happened. I decided I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to write a linear story of the family where one began at a certain point and slowly over time one arrived at the end, whatever the end was. And whatever, with a double meaning of the term, the end. So what I'd settled on, which may or may not be the right decision, I don't know, is I settled on taking up a series of episodes, unrelated to each other except for the fact that they all had to do with me and my family. But I don't try to connect them in a linear narrative, as historians more often than not do. I present these events as they come to my mind. I speculate, perhaps more than I should have, about the significance or the implications of these events. And I try in this manner to depict a picture that has a kind of internal logic, as it were, but not an internal logic of linearly connected episodes. This issue of time, of course, being super old as I am, a question of time is important for anyone who's old. For me, as I was writing this book, this became one of the, how shall I say, the defining issues that I try to grapple with time and again.
So I'd like to explore that. I was quite struck. So it's interesting that this reviewer in Greece said you lost your childhood years, because what was so interesting to me about the way you describe things in the book is that the image that you give is, in fact, the wartime years were a time of terrific, I don't want to say exactly freedom, but exploration. The unknown was exciting, and you experienced liberation as going back to being cooped up at home with your mum rather worriedly keeping an eye on you every minute because she's not going to let you out of her sight ever again, kind of thing. And I like that inversion of the of what one might have expected, precisely because it felt very true to the little boy's sense of things. And so there was a sense in which the old man could, in fact, with an effort, think himself back or understand the importance of recapturing that sense of the future that you had. I was interested, I'd like to press you a little more on why a linear account, just a straightforward, we'll start with the great-grandparents and we'll end with my kids, kind of narrative of family was not what you wanted, because, and I ask and I'm interested because I'm having tried my hand at something similar, although not in any way daring in my case to get onto the subject of my parents. I also found the impossibility of writing a simple linear narrative account, that there was something about the way I wanted, it wasn't even a question of will, the way one got into the story that you wanted to tell, that the past and the present were constantly intermingling. And if you tried to do an analysis afterwards of what you'd written, of what time you were in, it kept moving around, but hopefully the reader would just be borne along by the current of this. So I'm actually quite interested in why you think you didn't want or couldn't do that, and what was pushing you to a much more, how shall I say, maybe more meditative, more associational, what was it about that form of approach to your war years seemed to you to be more likely to allow you to do what you wanted?
Again, the quick answer to your very interesting question is I don't know. Mm-hmm. It seemed to, first of all, one step backward. The last seminar I taught at the European University Institute before I was forced to retire, this is a dig, was a seminar on biography that I taught with Jacques Ravel. And so I read a lot of method and approaches and questions. But the one book that really influenced me, really, it amazed me, was in posthumous, unfinished autobiography of a friend of mine, Michael Baxendall, the art historian. Michael was an extremely sensitive and very brilliant. The adjective is often used by academics when we talk among ourselves, but in this case, I think it is proper. In which he, as I say, he didn't finish. He died before finishing this book. So we don't know what form the book would have had he had a chance to finish it. But what struck me was that he zeroed in on some episodes of his life and talked about them in ways that some other critics have found irritating, in ways that I found extremely stimulating. And if there's something that I took away from that book, therefore it's not mine, was Baxendall's willingness to risk what in music one would call a staccato presentation, not to have an adagio, but staccato, that is individual incidents that were somehow or other in the subconscious of the author linked to each other, but in his writing, he didn't have the courage to try to imagine the connections. It seems to me that to write, if I knew how to solve this issue, I would write novels. But I don't know how to solve this issue. The context escapes me very often. The links between events escape me. So I thought I would be more effective by limiting each episode to itself, but that's not really quite true, is it? It's not limited to itself, because there is an implicit understanding that these incidents have to do with a question that I asked at the beginning. As the question was, why did we survive? So there's a conundrum of methodological issues that comes up that, as I said, every time somebody has confronted me about this book, I've tried to run around them. I don't want to face them. This is the best I can do, and I have tried to do it. And if you don't like it, you write your autobiography.
I know people want to ask questions, but you'll have to forgive me because I'm actually very interested in this issue. I'm just going to explore this a little moment longer. Perhaps part of the answer to the question why you choose this technique is that the episodic is what's left, it's what's remained. And you didn't choose what memories you retained, and you often go through this book wondering why you couldn't picture so-and-so's face, even though you lived with them, but you remembered this moment. And so it seems to me that you ended up with a procedure of trust in your own, or curiosity in your own, the subconscious, that part of you that had, in fact, for reasons you really can't necessarily explain, had preserved the traces of the history, was what was really important. And the rationalist historian part of you, that is a believer in social science, would take the back seat on this occasion because they were your own memories, would recognize the power of these things. And I think I think the validity of that is borne out in the book, but we're back to fortuna in a way. Mm-hmm. It's the fortuna of what happened to have stayed in your mind all these years that you structured this book around. And it's a wonderful read, and if you haven't read it, you absolutely should. And I'm going to shut up now and allow people to ask questions because we have, I think, 5-10 minutes. And so the floor is open, and if you'd put up your hand, I don't know if there's a microphone or not. Okay, so if you would like to ask a question, perhaps you'd put up your hand, and then when you get the microphone, just briefly identify yourself. And there's somebody up there. Yes. Sorry, in the back.
In the back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Christina Zarkadoulis, formerly of Brown also. I don't struggle as much with the episodic nature, the non-narrativity, because the more, cognitivists at this point now know we don't process the world linearly from either when we're a child or certainly as we age. It's not a sort of what we call in linguistics a syntactic approach, it's a semiotic approach, semantic approach. So I think it's marvelous that you want to sort of like keep questioning it, but I think it mirrors very much how we process the world at almost any age. And it's very hard to write that way, in my opinion. So I think...
In my opinion, too.
Yes. I mean, linearity... Leave it to the novelists. I just think that it's phenomenal what you've done, and can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have somebody to stand here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I wanted to know, what are some of the things that you learned about yourself in writing this book? Did you discover anything that surprised you?
And that you're willing to share with us.
Yeah, obviously, yes.
I gave a talk at Brown last week about this book, and somebody from the audience asked me, "Are you a better Jew after writing this book than you were before?" And I said, if I were seeing a rabbi frequently, I would ask him to answer the question. I can't know myself if I'm a better person than a better Jew than I was before. Flippant comments aside, one of the things that, the Ministry of Education in Greece asked me to present the book to some high schools. And the most interesting experience, they were all very interesting, I must say, but the most interesting, the most intense experience was the first one at the first model school in Plaka in Athens, where I discussed, I didn't speak only, I discussed the book with about 30, 15, 16-year-olds. The guys sat in the back and slept through the discussion. The girls were in the front and they were ready to talk. And one young lady, at the end of the discussion, by the way, as I hope to show you, took a rather interesting and to me unexpected turn. But this young lady started by saying, look, I don't understand, who are you, Tony Molho? Are you Greek, are you Jew, are you American, are you Italian, are you French? And then she said, what if there were a war between the United States and Greece? At that point, that seemed an almost surreal possibility. Now it's, on whose side, she said, would you fight? And I said, I would not fight. If there was such a war, I would run to France. And then the unexpected happened. The teacher one of the teachers raised her hand and said, okay, I understand all this about mixed identities and multiple identities and all that. Have you thought where you want to be buried when you die? And I said, yes, I have, at the Jewish cemetery in Salonika. Okay, that's your identity, she said. I had not thought of that before. And I was really taken aback. And out of that discussion, I realized that there is a kind of tension between liquid identity, multiple identity, an attempt to sort of assimilate as many diverse cultures as possible. But yet underneath, there's something that stays there. There's something hard that you don't overcome. And this is something that I've learned, not so much out of writing the book, but out of trying to discuss the book of a group of 15, 16-year-olds. I've learned, if I may say so, that in a society in which we live, I don't mean the United States, I mean the world, in which everything has to be either black or white, either good or bad, that sort of dichotomy, that sharp alternative, misses the reality of life. And there are gradations and gray zones, if you will. And I will illustrate, if I may, with one incident. During the war, in 1942, Germans had occupied Salonika in April 1941. So we're in full occupation period. 2 German soldiers were billeted in our house. So we had 2 soldiers living in a Jewish household in Salonika, Evzonon Street, number 24. They behaved entirely unlike what German soldiers were expected to behave. They were kind, they were thoughtful. When my father, who, by the way, was fluent in German and a great Germanophile before the war, when my father spoke with them and asked for help in finding medicines for my grandfather who suffered from his heart, one of these soldiers went out and found the medicines and brought him home. So the juxtaposition Auschwitz and the 2 German soldiers has not been unimportant in my mind. By the way, my mother totally rejected that view. When I told her the first time that my first car was going to be a Volkswagen, she almost fainted. She couldn't believe that I would do anything so stupid as that. She overcame that. Thanks in large measure to the charm and kindness of a person who's present tonight here. I won't identify him. This is what I learned. Whoever it is who asked the question, this is what I learned writing this book. Thank you.
Thank you. There's somebody at the far back, I'm sorry, on the other side. Sorry, this is terrific workout. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Angelica. So I work with a lot of young people who have come to the United States and represent them in their immigration process. And a lot of them have fled really horrible conditions, and I think are very stuck and can't see what the future would look like. So my question is, what advice would you give to young people who have fled difficult situations, war, gang violence, to help them see that there is a future and not to feel stuck?
It's difficult to give advice of the sort. You know, it depends on the person, it depends on the circumstances. And there is so much introspective thinking in our culture, it seems to me. People young and old, always sort of questioning themselves, who they are, what they are, whether they're happy or not. I'm not sure that's altogether a good thing. It may be, I don't know. I'm not going to give advice on that. But life is full of occasions where fortuna exercises its initiative, its benevolent or malevolent influence. And that's what we have to accept life. That's what it is. Sometimes it goes well, many times it does not.
Over there.
I'm sorry, I can't see you, but that's why I can hear you.
I hope you, I'll sit over here, stand here. I was curious if you had any memories after your parents left you in the care of those kind people you talked about. Do you have any memories of being afraid or of having a sense of danger around your life at 4 or 5?
Once, and I described that in the book because it was such an important moment. After, on the 20th of March, 1943, I was taken to the homes of Baba Yorgos and Mama Elpida, as I called them. The next day, as I was sleeping, in the middle of the night, on the eve of their escape from Salonika to Athens, my father came. I think he just wanted to see me once again. I was then, it's difficult for me to really grasp that moment, but I was then the age at which my great-granddaughter is now. And when I see her and try to project myself to her size, to her mind, I, as my other daughter would say, I freak out. Because I was sleeping in a dark room. My father tiptoed in that room, and he bent over me. He kissed me, and then he was very, very slowly moving away from the crib where I was sleeping. At that moment, I woke up. I don't know why. And I screamed. Believe me, I am convinced I remember this scene. I've always thought I remember that scene, with my hands up in the middle of the air, screaming. And it ends there. That's the memory. That's the one time when, even without having the words that I would need to express my feelings, I probably felt abandoned. But never again. Never again. Not only did I not feel abandoned, but as I describe in the book, once my mother took me in the summer of 1944, I tried to escape from home. And that says something. That says something.
Down here.
At what point were you aware of being Jewish? Were you aware as a child when you went into the convent, or after? At what point and how did you become aware of being Jewish?
I became aware of being Jewish after the war. I remember in 1945 in Sukkot, in a hastily arranged ceremony arranged by the Jewish community, what was left of the Jewish community in Salonika. I attended in 1948 a summer camp of the Jewish community of Salonika in what was a wonderful, wonderful sort of summer village away from about an hour boat ride from Thessaloniki, Agiatriada, which has become an insufferable, insupportable suburb of Salonika. I attended that summer camp. We, in all likelihood, we lit candles Friday night. It was about 3 months after the foundation of the State of Israel. We sang the Hatikva. Everybody in the camp was a Jew. And there was no question at all but that I was Jewish. Now, what that meant is another story, and a complicated story. Suffice it to say that my parents did not allow me to go back to the camp the second year. So that's when the issue of, some of you may have read Saul Friedlander's memoir, When Memory Comes. It's wonderful, wonderful memoir of a very distinguished Czech-born Jewish historian who taught for years at UCLA, where he was left in a convent. He was a little older than I. He's still alive. But he was converted to Catholicism. And it was only the story of what we call the Holocaust, recounted to Saul Friedlander by, I'm not sure now if it's a monk or a nun, that detail, but somebody, a church person. Only then Friedlander realizes that he's Jewish and decides to abandon his dreams of becoming a priest in the Catholic Church. Jean-Marie Lustiger, as some of you know, was Jewish. He was converted during the war, and like a nice Jewish boy, he ended up being the Archbishop of Paris. So there was no effort, as far as I know, of the Catholic nuns to convert me. That's an important point. There was no effort to convert me. even though I was a very little boy, right? I was led to attend the masses in church, in the small chapel in the convent, during the few months I was there.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your remarkable experience and memories. You mentioned a couple of times that you have to accept your fate, and I agree with that. Now, having accepted your fate, my question is, can you talk in terms of how did you feel as a boy in Athens? Were you a happy boy, a sad boy, some different emotional state?
I think I was happy, but I don't know. I mean, I remember after my parents had left Salonika, and after the great, incredible adventure settled in Athens, they ensured that I would be also transported to Athens. And I also had my share of adventure in this trip. And what I think I remember, or at least my mother said to me many times, how happy and well-fed I seemed to be when I arrived in Athens. The well-fed part of it is in great contrast with what happened the following year, when food was extremely difficult to find in Athens. But whether I was happy, I don't know. I mean, the fact that I had this disastrous adventure of trying to escape from my mother, and we were then living in a small house, sharing rather the house with an older lady and her daughter. This is near, for those of you who know Athens, near Papadiamandi Square in Patissia. And I obviously chose the wrong day to escape from the house, because as I was leaving the house, my mother became aware of what was going on. She alerted a policeman who came and took me by the hand and took me to Papadiamandi Square, where 4 partisans had just been executed by hanging. And the square was just jammed full of people. I remember parts of that. And I remember the policeman who had taken me by the hand and taken me to the site of that execution turned to me and said something that has stayed with me all my life. It's the most terrible thing anybody has ever told to me. He said, "You see what happens to little boys who run away from home?" This is the level of psychological understanding that prevailed among the police force in Greece at the time, but not only in Greece, obviously. So I don't know if I was happy or not. Sometimes I was happy, sometimes I was not. I was happy when my mother, through her work at the Red Cross, managed to bring a bar of chocolate home on 12 July 1944 for my 5th birthday. I didn't know what that was. The discovery of chocolate was just a moment of great happiness, as was the discovery of ice cream several months later. Generally, I would say I was not unhappy. That doesn't answer the question of whether I was happy or not.
Maybe on that note, thank you both very much. And